Recently on Diary of a CEO, Stephen Bartlett interviewed a woman named Erica Komisar, who had some pretty controversial things to say, including that it's irreversibly damaging for kids to be in daycare up until age 3, mothers are selfish if they choose to go back to work up until that age, and ADHD is just caused by sensitivity, meaning again it's just things like attachment trauma causing ADHD. Who is Erica Komisar? Well, she's a clinical social worker, psychoanalyst, and parent guidance expert. She's written several books, emphasizing the importance of mothers putting their careers on hold during the first 3 years of their child's life. And she has 3 well-adjusted children herself, as well as a very high-powered career and a dual-income household. This interview caught my attention for a few reasons. First of all, as a psychodynamically leaning doctor of psychology myself, I completely agree with Erica about the importance of attachment security. And as an expecting mother myself, 30 weeks at the time of filming this, I've been doing a lot of thinking about how I want to balance work and raising a child in those first few years. And the reason I'm grinding so hard during pregnancy is because I want to be able to dedicate as much time as possible to my baby once they're born. Because again, I understand that it's crucial to their attachment security. However, despite Erica's claim that she only says things that are unequivocally supported by the research,
sometimes facts are an inconvenient truth, but everything I'm going to say is supported by research.
And her repeated claim that it's just the inconvenient truth.
It's an inconvenient truth. It's an inconvenient truth. There's the inconvenient truth. That's the inconvenient truth. Realistically, here's the inconvenient truth again. Bunch of inconvenient truths. And that's the inconvenient truth. If we cannot as a society acknowledge the inconvenient truth, because they're the inconvenient truths that are stopping us from having healthy children.
There were several points in the interview where I found her statements to be unsupported by empirical consensus. But also just beyond that, I found myself pretty troubled by the implications of her message. I was going through the comments under this video, and I noticed there were a lot of women giving grand testimonials about how she's so right. They were conned by feminism into believing that they should prioritize their careers over their family, and they can see how much their children suffered. For example, here's one such comment. For those who are upset at what she preaches, she's here to shine a light on an uncomfortable truth. As a working mom, a Democrat, and an agnostic living in New York, I enjoy my job, but I can't ignore the fact that placing my child in daycare wasn't the best thing for her. It may have been beneficial for me, but not for my baby. I witnessed attachment issues and sadness in her eyes after long hours apart. Then COVID hit, and thankfully I was able to work from home. Since then, I've seen a remarkable shift in her behavior. She's happier, less anxious, and more secure. There's an undeniable biological and evolutionary truth here. Social media glamorizes long working hours and portrays being a strong, independent working woman as admirable, but glorifying relentless work at the expense of our children isn't the right path. I'm not saying women shouldn't work, but work should never take priority over our kids. When you're on your deathbed, your boss and coworkers won't be by your side. Your family will. You won't wish you had worked more. Instead, your thoughts will be about your children. If Erica's message upsets you, ask yourself why. Is it because you're denying a truth that you already know deep down? You feel frustrated that you haven't found a way to prioritize your children? You feel trapped in your job and are looking for someone to blame? It's a tough conversation, but one worth having. And whenever my BS meter goes off, I always wonder, what are other people saying about this? Are other people sharing the same concerns as me, seeing what I'm seeing here? So I looked up what people say about this Erica Komisar interview on Reddit, the pinnacle of esoteric knowledge, as well as the cesspool of humanity, of course. And usually going to Reddit leaves me feeling even more misanthropic than I went going into it, and I end up sympathizing with the person that people are criticizing on there more than with the neckbeards doing the criticizing. But in this case, I found something very peculiar. Someone made a critical post about Erica Komisar a few days ago, and under that post, it's the most curious thing. Someone posted the exact same comment that I just read to you from YouTube. Interestingly, this person created an account the day they left this comment, and they have no other activity on Reddit. And some of the people in the Reddit thread pointed this out, sharing doubts about whether this person is actually a working mom, Democrat, and agnostic living in New York, as they say, and wondering if this might be a bot. And I gotta say, I share some of those same questions. Sure, this could be someone who saw Erica's interview on Diary of a CEO and resonated with it so strongly that they decided to look her up on Reddit and create a whole Reddit account just to defend her viewpoints. But I have to wonder, is there perhaps something else going on here? Maybe somebody who has a much more personally vested interest in promoting Erica's message? Who has something to gain from us believing Erica's message? And now I have to wonder, how many of the other moving testimonials on the comment section of that interview are perhaps also a little bit questionable in authenticity. We live in an era in which tradwife content is on the rise, and there's a real push to see things through rose-tinted glasses about the good old days, when women were all stay-at-home moms. We now have parenting experts explicitly telling women to sacrifice their careers for their children. And they weaponize people's frustrations with the economy, the capitalist system, high-pressure work environments, in order to make us believe that we've been lied to, that having the choice about whether or not to be a stay-at-home mother was actually worse off for us and for our children. Well, today I'm here to tell you why I'm very skeptical of this narrative. In this video, I'm going to fact-check some of Erica Komisar's claims on parenting, attachment, and ADHD. I'm also going to share why I think her messaging is harmful, because no, this isn't a matter of the inconvenient truth. This isn't a matter of facts don't care about your feelings. In my opinion, this is a matter of psychology being weaponized to further an ideological agenda. So let's get into it. So after Stephen Bartlett introduces Erica Komisar and her philosophy on parenting, Erica begins talking about how society took a turn during the Industrial Revolution when women were forced into labor away from their children.
The Industrial Revolution was a time when women were forced into the workplace, into factories and cities. They were separated from children for the first time. We were abandoning our children for our own desires, for our careers, for material success. Women have the same rights as men, and now everybody can be in the workforce and be independent and make money and do their own thing. Me, 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 me. The problem is that children were dropped. They were abandoned.
Babies are not just born resilient like they're expected to be, Erica says. She calls it a me, me, me attitude that moms want to return to work after having children. According to Erica, children under 3 years old who attend daycare go on to develop attachment disorders, aggression, anxiety, and behavioral problems. They experience a spike in stress hormone cortisol that children, she says, should never feel for those first 3 years of their life, or else it leads to irreversible damage. Children also don't need socialization before age 3, she says. The best form of childcare for those first 3 years, she says, is the primary attachment figure, which is usually the mom because it doesn't come naturally to most men.
It doesn't come naturally to most men, with rare exception.
Now, there are some seeds of truth in what Erica is saying. Low-quality daycare, as we'll go into in just a minute, has been associated with worse outcomes for children, and experiencing early attachment ruptures also sets children up for later mental health problems. However, daycare as a whole, as I'm about to go into the research in just a moment, does not automatically cause attachment insecurity and the whole host of negative outcomes that come with that. Now, Stephen calls her out for emphasizing moms, who she's speaking to specifically, rather than parents as a whole, and not including dads in this conversation. Side note here, I do think it's good that Stephen is making bigger efforts to give pushback to some of his interviewees' controversial claims. If you're not aware, the Diary of a CEO podcast recently came under fire when scientific experts from a wide range of fields pointed out that there's a staggering amount of misinformation being shared to his audience of millions of people, with little to no pushback from Steve during these interviews. However, as we'll get to in a little bit, I found Stephen's pushback to be quite surface level in this interview. He'd offer a piece of criticism, then Erica would give what I found to be a very unsatisfactory counter-argument, and he'd just kind of leave it at that. If anything, I feel like this gives the audience the impression that the interviewee has already debunked a piece of criticism, even when in fact they have not. Either because they twisted the findings of a scientific article, or their answer didn't directly address the question, or they didn't engage with the counterpoint that was actually brought up. So while I commend Stephen for trying to incorporate the feedback he's received, I still have to wonder whether he's the best person to be interviewing these experts. Unless you're familiar with the scientific landscape that person is coming from, you're not going to be able to call them on the BS because you just don't know what you don't know. Anyway, side note over, Erica responds to Stephen that fathers are important but in a different way. She says that moms are good for sensitive empathic nurturing, that soothing babies results in emotion regulation. And this is absolutely true. This is something I cover on my channel all the time, that babies learn how to regulate themselves by being soothed by their primary caregiver. She says that a dad's oxytocin hormone has a different effect on men than it does on women. It comes from a different part of the brain and causes him to have more of a role in play and roughhousing with his children rather than cuddling or soothing them. And this also is true. Moms tend to be more of the cuddlers and dads tend to be more of the playful roughhousers with their children. As renowned relationship researcher John Gottman says in his book Raising an Emotionally Intelligent Child, many researchers believe that fathers influence their children primarily through play. Not only do dads typically spend a greater percentage of their time with children in playful activities, but they also engage in styles of play that are more physical and more exciting than the way mothers interact. Many psychologists believe that dad's raucous style of horseplay provides an important avenue for helping children learn about emotions. Imagine dad as a scary bear chasing a delighted toddler across the yard, or lifting and twirling the child over his head for an airplane ride. Such games allow the child to experience the thrill of being just a little bit scared but amused and aroused at the same time. As John Gottman explains, this roughhousing is also crucial to a child developing emotional intelligence, so it's not just the mom soothing that contributes to the child's emotion regulation. Having roughhoused with dad, he knows how to read other people's signals when feelings run high. But by minimizing the role of this play and saying, well, yeah, it's just different, moms are the ones that need to ultimately foster emotion regulation in children, Erica neglects to mention the fact that research has found that dad's role in parenting actually has more of an extreme effect on the child. Kids whose fathers showed high levels of physical play were most popular among their peers. While our studies showed that mother-child interactions were also important, quality of contact with the mother was not as strong a predictor of the child's later success or failure with school or friends. So unfortunately, this puts a little bit of a strain on Erica's arguments that, yeah, dads are important, but moms are just so much more important for children developing emotion regulation and healthy attachment. If anything, some of the research says dads are even more important. Erica also cites a study from the UK which said that dads woke up right away when they heard leaves rustling outside the windows, whereas moms didn't. She cites this as a way of suggesting that moms and dads are just biologically wired different, and we shouldn't try to pretend otherwise because it's inconvenient for us to hear. I was really curious about this study because methodologically it sounds pretty complex to study. You would have to have almost like a sleep study with people where you somehow experimentally put rustling leaves outside the window and then measure whether they wake up or not. Unfortunately, I couldn't find the source for this claim anywhere, so I can't actually take a look at the study in question. What I can say is that even if there is a statistically significant difference between how men and women approach parenting as a whole, individual differences between members of a group are usually much greater than the slight trend differences between groups of people, like men and women. So I don't think it's particularly helpful to make prescriptive statements about how moms need to stay at home with their children because men and women are just different, because the people listening to that have a lot of variability. They are not just members of the category men or women, they are individuals who vary wildly from one to the next. For example, I am a pretty light sleeper. I would probably wake up to rustling leaves outside the window, whereas my husband would most definitely sleep through them. I mean, he would probably sleep through me going into labor at this point. Eric is also ignoring a very important point, which is that the exact gender of the primary attachment figure does not matter. Studies have shown that secure attachment can develop regardless of the gender of the primary attachment figure. For example, a meta-analysis found that higher levels of paternal sensitivity were associated with more infant-father attachment security, so we should not underestimate the importance of dads in developing secure attachment. Although Erica does very briefly acknowledge that men are, in rare cases, the primary attachment figure, that doesn't seem to deter her from aiming her message at mothers specifically. As for her claim that mothers need to spend nearly every waking hour with their children in order for those children to develop secure attachment and that daycare below the age of 3 is terrible for children because it stresses them out, studies have documented that toddlers experience elevated amounts of cortisol when they start going to daycare. However, these cortisol levels often return to low levels after just 3 months, and child well-being continues to be perceived as high at that time. From the researchers themselves, toddlers need time to adapt to childcare settings. Also, no study says that parents need to spend every waking hour with their children in order for those children to develop secure attachment. The quality of the time spent together, meaning is the parent empathically attuned to them, are they validating their emotions, are they emotionally present, is far more important than the actual quantity of hours spent together. For example, a meta-analysis from 2016 analyzed over 4,000 parent-child dyads and found that maternal sensitivity, not hours spent together, is the strongest predictor of secure attachment. Does sending kids to daycare before age 3 result in catastrophic outcomes for them later on? A meta-analysis that looked at over 87,000 parent-child dyads in 5 countries in the EU found that compared to children who were exclusively cared for by their parents prior to school entry, those who attended center-based childcare had lower levels of internalizing symptoms in all age groups up to age 13. Internalizing symptoms, if you're not aware, are things like depression or anxiety, things that are more like turned inwards rather than causing problems externally. According to the researchers themselves, children attending center-based childcare may be more likely to learn emotion regulation, cooperation, and conflict resolution skills compared to children attending informal childcare. Children in center-based childcare may have access to better resources and facilities designed for children compared to informal childcare, which may be home-based, and children in center-based childcare may receive higher quality care due to the educational requirements and child-specific training that professional staff are required to have in center-based childcare. Also, when it comes to childcare, like I said, the most important factor is the quality of the daycare. According to the NICHD study of early childcare from 2006, results showed that children who experienced higher quality childcare consistently showed somewhat better cognitive function and language development across the first 3 years of life. Higher quality childcare also predicted greater school readiness at 4.5 years of age, as reflected in standardized tests of literacy and number skills. Children who experienced higher quality childcare had mothers who were more likely to show slightly higher levels of sensitivity when interacting with their children at 6 to 3 years old. I found this particularly interesting because if sending children to high quality daycare is associated with higher amounts of sensitivity for moms, isn't that a good thing? Isn't that exactly what Erica would want for children in order to foster attachment security? It certainly makes sense to me. If you're the only person raising your child and you have to completely put your well-being on hold, it's only a matter of time before it's going to start to take a toll on your ability to show up emotionally for your child. Children who experienced higher quality childcare were somewhat more cooperative and compliant and slightly less aggressive and disobedient at 2 and 3 years of age. Children were sometimes more likely to be insecurely attached to their mothers if they were in lower quality childcare, but only if their mothers were also lower in sensitivity during interactions with their children. So it's not even just the quality of the childcare that matters, it's the quality of the childcare combined with the mom's lack of sensitivity. Higher quality childcare predicted more positive interactions with other children at 3 years of age. Now, as for the quantity of daycare, how long kids are actually spending there, for young children whose mothers showed low levels of sensitivity during mother-child interactions, more than 10 hours of care each week did increase the risk of insecure attachment. Children who spent more time in childcare were somewhat less cooperative, more disobedient, and more aggressive at age 2 and 4.5, and in kindergarten, but not at age 3. Children who averaged 30 hours of childcare or more each week during their first 4.5 years of life were somewhat more likely to show problem behaviors at age 4 and in kindergarten, but childcare quantity did not predict problem behaviors in the home environment as reported by the mothers. Time spent in childcare also did not predict clinical levels of behavior problems, and once again, family features were stronger predictors of children's social behavior and development than was the quantity of childcare. So the bottom line, according to the study, was many family features are more strongly and more consistently linked to child development outcomes than are childcare features for children up to age 4.5. The following characteristics predicted children's cognitive, language, and social development: parents' education, family income, and two-parent family compared to single-parent family, mother's psychological adjustment and sensitivity, and the social and cognitive quality of the home environment. Also, we have to remember that all of these are correlational. Causality between attachment issues and the mom going to work has not been established by this, as this is not an experiment sending some kids to daycare and others not. On to other inconvenient truths that Erica is ignoring. Erica's stance that mothers specifically are crucial to developing healthy attachment ignores the wealth of research we have showing that children with 2 dads turn out just as great. Meta-analysis after meta-analysis shows that same-sex couples produce just as psychologically healthy children as couples where there's a man and a woman. So it's kind of strange that Erica mentioned she tells same-sex couples they have to decide which one's going to be the mom in the family.
Sometimes gay couples will come to me and I'll say, 2 gay men will come. I'll say, which one of you is going to be the mother?
Children benefit from having 2 loving parents and 2 incomes in the household. The exact gender of those parents is not important. And I frankly worry about the way that homophobes are going to weaponize Erica's rhetoric. Another point that Erica ignores is that single moms can't afford not to work. We have a real problem with absent fathers in particularly American culture. So I wonder how Erica's rhetoric lands for women who have to be both the sole breadwinner and the sole caregiver. When asked about whether her message is going to cause parents to feel guilty, Erica says that she doesn't think guilt is a bad thing.
I don't believe that guilt is a bad thing.
And I don't disagree with Erica here. I'm all about prioritizing the well-being of children over the triggered feelings of their parent. And I trigger parents on my channel all the time with some of the things I talk about. But if Erica's words are causing single moms to feel guilty over something they have no control over when they're just trying to do their best, how exactly is that productive? Who is it helping? And lastly, Erica's ignoring the fact that even in two-parent households, most moms can't afford not to work. Even in my own situation, I am blessed in so many ways that my husband and I both get to work for ourselves, get to work from home, that I've had a very smooth pregnancy that allows me to really grind in anticipation for the baby coming. But even so, we need two incomes in order to make a living. In this day and age, it is just so incredibly rare for just one breadwinner to be able to support an entire family. And financial stability has a huge impact on children's emotional well-being. I also find that Erica's stance on motherhood echoes an almost biblical type of self-sacrificial martyrdom that's expected of mothers. She flat out calls it selfish for moms to prioritize their careers.
We're raising our children in such a selfish, self-centered environment. We prioritize everything today other than our children. We prioritize our work, our careers, our material success, our personal desires and pleasures, but what we're not prioritizing is children.
But unfortunately, it doesn't actually benefit the child if the mother is neglecting her own needs. Just like they tell you on a plane, you have to put on your own oxygen mask first before the child's. Because if you're passed out, which happens very quickly, you're not going to be able to save your child anymore. Just the same with parenting, you have to be able to make sure that you are good, that you're taking care of yourself, if you want to be able to also make sure that your child grows up to have healthy, secure attachment. If a mother is unhappy with her life, either because she's had to sacrifice what's important to her, or because she can't handle the stress of being a stay-at-home mom, or any other reason, that has a negative impact on children. Erica seems concerned with children under age 3 having high levels of the stress hormone cortisol, yet she neglects to mention that depressed mothers have infants with greater amounts of cortisol. So maybe letting someone else take care of them would be better for the child by comparison if part of the reason why they're depressed is because they can't afford to put food on the table or they can't handle being a stay-at-home mom. Stressed moms who gave up their careers and now don't have enough income or are stuck in abusive relationships and can't get out because they don't have the financial means, are certainly going to create more stressed babies. But even beyond that, even putting aside the fact that most people just simply cannot give up their job in this day and age, not all women are forced into their careers. I really find this line of thinking a little bit offensive as somebody who loves what she does. I am so blessed that I get to do the thing that gives me the most joy in life, that I love my day-to-day schedule. Spending time in flow, finding our ikigai in life, finding our meaning and purpose, that is a natural pursuit of being human. And it's not fair to tell one half of the population, you have to put all of that on hold because you decided to have another human being. I also find that Erica exaggerates the harm done by a healthy work-life balance. Erica says that children can only be apart from their primary attachment figure for their age in hours. So 1 hour a day for a 1-year-old, 2 hours a day for a 2-year-old. Once again, I could find no study to support this claim, and I'm doubtful that it exists considering it would be methodologically nearly impossible to study. To determine causality, researchers would have to randomly assign moms to different groups where they separate them from their children for a specific number of hours per day, then follow those families for years and track the children's outcomes longitudinally. Or to simply determine a correlation, they would have to ask moms how long they're spending apart from their children, then follow those families for years and track the children's outcomes longitudinally. To my knowledge, no such study has been done, and there's no rule of thumb or cutoff that has been found to determine how long is exactly okay for primary caregivers to spend away from their children. Obviously, spending huge amounts of time away from your child is not ideal, but that's not necessarily what's involved in moms still keeping up with their jobs after having a baby. There are people who manage to strike a balance between healthy work life. Erica says that moms have to sacrifice time, money, and freedom to raise healthy children. But what are the implications of needing to raise a child without those things? What do you think is going to happen to the child whose mother is now financially dependent in an unhappy or even abusive relationship? Or the child whose mother resents them because she was never able to pick up her career back up after taking an extended maternity leave? Or the child whose mother cannot be empathically attuned to them because she's so overwhelmed from being the sole caregiver at home and she feels she's lost her sense of purpose? Or the child whose parents can barely afford to put food on the table because dad is not making enough on his own in this economy, who now can't afford to go into a good school or ends up in debt or can't break out of the cycle of poverty? Or the child whose dad unexpectedly passes away and the mom is now left to figure out how to be a breadwinner after taking a years-long hiatus from the job market? And what about all the studies I mentioned showing that high-quality daycare can be beneficial for children? I certainly concede that kids spending many hours in low-quality daycare up until age 3 can be associated with negative psychological outcomes. But it's simply not as black and white as Erica would want us to believe. We always have to ask ourselves, is daycare better for the child compared to the alternative? If the alternative is being in a financially stable home with a loving, sensitive stay-at-home mom, then yeah, maybe daycare is a worse option. But if the alternative is being at home with a mom who's overwhelmed or in a household that's struggling to stay above the poverty line, daycare is absolutely not the boogeyman Erica's making it out to be. Also, as part of my research for this video, I stumbled on something very interesting. So there's a study titled A Meta-Analysis of the Impact of Early Childhood Interventions on the Development of Children in the Netherlands, An Inconvenient Truth. And I thought, oh my God, is this where Erica got the expression inconvenient truth? Let me see what it has to say. So this was a meta-analysis examining Dutch early intervention programs, and the findings were that these specialized ECEC programs didn't offer additional benefits compared to regular early childhood education programs for Dutch kids. So what is the inconvenient truth that they're talking about here? The outcome of this review study may be inconvenient for some ECEC stakeholders in the Netherlands. The inconvenient truth is not that daycare is harmful to children, just that these specialized specific programs in the Netherlands specifically do not confer additional benefits compared to regular early childcare. And the authors themselves acknowledge the Dutch results are clearly inferior to those obtained in the successful interventions implemented abroad, possibly because the Dutch early interventions are less intensive than those in the US, possibly because the Dutch control group started off in a better position than American kids, so the margin of success was lower. Regardless, this is not the inconvenient truth that Erica warns about. The inconvenient truth here is for stakeholders involved in these programs, not parents sending their kids to daycare. Erica then goes on a bit of a rant about how a society with declining birth rates suggests an issue with selfishness and intimacy.
The alarming thing for me is that people are not having children. That's more alarming to me because that's more a sign not of a country developing, but of a country and a society, of a modern society, which does not see the value in raising children and having deep and loving relationships be a priority in your life.
And Stephen asks her, what about people who have very meaningful relationships with the adults in their lives? Erica responds that it's not the same thing. Relationships with babies are just different.
It's different because in the end, your relationship with your partner or with your auntie or with your dog isn't the same level of dependency. The ability to care for another human being, to allow another human being to be dependent on you, to devote to that human being, is a growing, transforming experience for human beings.
And look, I've spoken on this channel about how I'm concerned with Americans growing hyper-individualistic, you don't owe anyone anything, my boundaries are impenetrable type of attitude. And I do think probably part of the declining birth rate in the US can be attributed to the fact that people don't see the value in selflessly giving to another human being anymore. I think that's a small part of the equation, but I think that the majority of the equation is caused by the fact that people just can't afford to have kids in the current climate. And even if it were true that most people are choosing not to have kids just because they're selfish, why would you want to shame selfish people for not having kids? There's so much harm that can come from selfish people becoming parents, and I think maybe we should let evolution filter those people out. She also says that it's a myth that moms can have both a fabulous career and be a caregiver.
Another myth is you can do everything all at the same time and do it well. Myth. That's a big myth. You can't. You can't have a fabulous career, working full-time and traveling and being fabulous, and raise healthy children.
Erica says that you can just postpone your fabulous career like she did. But is that actually doable? The unfortunate truth is that the job market is extremely competitive these days, and with AI picking up, it's only going to get more and more competitive. So having a 3+ year gap in your CV is not going to look amazing to employers. Clearly, it was possible for Erica. She says she had a career in her 20s, met her husband at 27, had kids in her 30s, took 6 months off with each child, then only went back to work for 1.5 hours per day, 5 days a week. Erica acknowledges that some careers are more mom-friendly than others. Her job as a social worker, for instance, my job as an author YouTuber, afford for far more flexibility than if you're, say, an attorney or a physician. But she says it's doable to not even start a career until your 40s. And in my opinion, yes, these things can be done, but we need to be realistic about the fact that they're going to be very challenging and very high risk. So maybe this isn't the first thing that we should recommend to people. I'm not at all a fan of telling women to cut off their only source of income because it leaves them extremely vulnerable in the world. If a woman chooses to do that, great. But I wonder how many of the 1 million people that watched her video are men with maybe less than ideal intentions who are now going to pressure their wives into giving up their careers for their children. And while Erica might have a tough shit, facts don't care about your feelings attitude towards moms, leaving women vulnerable also leaves their children vulnerable. At this point, Stephen asks Erica if there are aspects of privilege that maybe she needs to acknowledge. Erica gives a quasi-answer to this question by criticizing the lack of paid maternity leave in different countries. For example, she says Sweden forces women to send babies to daycare at 2 years old, and they all break down.
Sweden, after 14 months, makes women go back to work full time and put them in institutional care, and all those babies are breaking down.
Yeah, so listen, I'm not from Sweden. If you are, please fact check me in the comments. But as far as I can find, this is a blatant fabrication. School is not mandatory in Sweden until age 6. Preschool is available to all children starting at age 1. Attendance is optional from age 3, and all children are entitled to at least 3 hours of free preschool education daily, but outside of that, they need to pay for childcare. And again, up until age 6, it's optional. And also, I could find no evidence to suggest that Swedish children break down as a result of going to school. In fact, Sweden's early childhood education system has often been praised for its learning methods. Stephen then asks Erica to support her argument for maternity leave lasting 3 years with empirical evidence. And Erica replies,
the longitudinal attachment research shows that children who are insecurely attached at 12 months of age, 20 years later, are insecurely, 80% of them are insecurely attached and suffer from mental disorders.
And while yes, it's true that attachment style tends to be rather stable over time starting from a very young age, this doesn't answer Stephen's question at all, because Erica still has not managed to provide any convincing empirical basis for the claim that attachment insecurity is caused by mothers going back to work before their kids are 3 years old. As we discussed, any research on this is correlational, not causational, and it shows that the quality of both the attachment and the daycare is far more important than the quantity of time spent at daycare. This is an example of what I was talking about earlier, where Stephen gives a counter-argument to his interviewee, but she circumnavigates it without actually interacting with it or supporting it by actual empirical evidence, and he just kind of leaves it at that. So in essence, this has the opposite effect, giving uninformed listeners the impression that she just debunked the counter-argument. It's the equivalent of Stephen pretending to block her in a game of basketball while actually passing the ball for her to slam dunk. Next, Stephen breaks up the fact that ADHD is on the rise. Now here, Erica again seems to be convinced that ADHD is caused by early stress in the first 3 years of life. She says the amygdala, which is involved in the stress response, is supposed to stay offline for those first 3 years, and that children are not supposed to experience basically any stress.
What we know is that part of the brain is supposed to remain offline for the first year to 3 years, which is why mothers wear babies on their bodies.
First of all, it is virtually impossible for the amygdala to stay offline for 3 whole years. Anytime a child cries because they're hungry or they need changing, they experience a spike in cortisol and activity in their amygdala. Reducing amygdala activity down to 0 is unheard of and unrealistic. Also, the relationship between stress and resilience is a U-shaped curve. Despite society constantly feeding us the message that any stress is bad for us, experiencing some level of stress is actually associated with the best outcomes compared to experiencing no stress at all. If you want a more in-depth look at the research on this, check out my video on the book The Upside of Stress. For example, Norman Garmezzi's research found that exposure to manageable stressors when combined with supportive relationships can help a child better cope with future challenges. He found that stress doesn't inherently lead to negative outcomes. Rather, a child's protective factors determine whether they're going to turn out okay. These protective factors include individual traits like high IQ, problem-solving skills, optimism, and self-regulation, supportive relationships, meaning at least one stable, caring adult in their life, and environmental support, such as a supportive school environment and access to community resources. He also found that not only are some children resilient to stress, but some actually experience post-traumatic growth. So I'm always wary of people who try to make human beings seem more fragile than they are. Living in a safe little bubble where you never experience any stress or your amygdala completely stays offline is not going to fortify us as a species. We don't need to be terrified of stress, we just need to get better at coping with it. Even in utero, some people have suggested prenatal stress can foster resilience in the fetus, helping them better cope with stress once they're born. Also, Erica acts like a dysfunctional amygdala is a life sentence that you can never recover from. Yet studies have shown that even just 8 weeks of meditation can reduce the size of the amygdala. She uses very catastrophic language to exaggerate the harm that parents cause children by working, I guess. While we should certainly be trying to minimize stress for children as much as possible, temporarily experiencing distress because you're separated from a caregiver at daycare is not the catastrophic, irreversible trauma that Erica wants us to believe it is. So while we should be working on minimizing severe stress and trauma for children, we do not need to treat them like they're pieces of china. Treating them like they're that fragile will not help them in the long run. So Erica says that the cause of ADHD and behavioral problems is that children's amygdalas are too large and their hippocampuses are too small.
What we're seeing in children's brains is that the amygdala is growing very precociously large and the hippocampus, which is the off switch, is very small.
I will preface this by saying that, like Erica, I'm not an expert in the neuroscience of ADHD. However, this is definitely inconsistent with what I've been taught in my education as a doctor of psychology and with what ADHD experts currently say is the consensus. ADHD experts typically talk about the following brain structures and neurotransmitters involved in ADHD. The prefrontal cortex for people with ADHD tends to be smaller and less active. This is the part of the brain that focuses on impulse control, attention, executive functioning. There are also some structural differences in the basal ganglia, which are responsible for motor control and reward processing issues that may be partly involved in hyperactivity. And people with ADHD do tend to show some variations in the size of the amygdala and hippocampus, but these are not a defining feature of ADHD, and it's literally not as simple as the amygdala is too large in people with ADHD. In fact, a large meta-analysis from 2017 found that people with ADHD actually have slightly smaller amygdalas, not larger. Also, dysfunction with the neurotransmitters dopamine and norepinephrine is involved in ADHD. ADHD experts also tend to talk about the fact that ADHD is highly heritable, so about 70 to 80% heritable. There are also prenatal and early life risk factors that have been established, like low birth weight, prenatal exposure to substances, environmental factors like screen exposure, sleep quality, and diet. To my knowledge, daycare attendance before age 3 has never been identified as a risk factor for ADHD, but Erica is welcome to cite a source for that because I'm sure she wouldn't make such a bold claim without evidence.
I'm very skittish about saying anything that isn't backed up with research. So it's everything that I write about and speak about is supported by research.
So as for this idea that sending kids to daycare causes them to be stressed, which causes them to have ADHD, as we discussed, the research does not show that daycare is automatically negative for kids. Those spikes in cortisol are temporary and they can be reversible. And also, are kids today really more stressed out than they were back in the day, during World War II, World War I, during the Middle Ages, during prehistoric times? I really reject this notion that kids today are so much more stressed than they ever have been in the history of humanity. Now, when Stephen points out the heritability of ADHD, Erica replies that there's no genetic precursor for ADHD, rather a genetic tie to the sensitivity gene, which is a short allele on the serotonin receptor that makes you more sensitive to stress. She says if those children are provided emotionally and physically present attachment security in the first year, it neutralizes the gene. Now again, like Erica, I'm not a geneticist, but I did my best to look at the research on this topic, and here's what I found. ADHD is indeed associated with mood disorders, and genetic researchers theorize that there might be some genetic commonalities at play. One study found, for instance, that the 5-HTT-LPR genotype that I believe she's talking about may play a role in the impulsivity component shared between childhood ADHD and adult bipolar II disorder. And early childhood experiences do play a large role in whether people with this genotype will go on to develop mental health issues later on. However, I could find no empirical support for the idea that moms dedicating the first 3 years of their child's life to their children does anything to prevent ADHD. Like we discussed, attachment security is about so much more than just the quantity of hours that you spend with your child. And yes, ADHD is one of the most overdiagnosed and misdiagnosed current diagnoses that we have in society. And I have no doubt that many of the kids diagnosed with ADHD today actually have some sort of trauma or a precursor to a mood disorder. But it's considered quite a fringe belief that all ADHD is just caused by the sensitivity gene plus early trauma. The scientific consensus is that ADHD is one of the most neurobiologically based disorders that we have. It is neurodevelopmental. It is believed that from pretty much birth, people with ADHD have brains that work differently. And while it's an interesting theory that Erica Komisar has that might not be the case, at the end of the day, I'm going to go with the experts who have dedicated their lives to researching this. Towards the end of the interview, Erica talks about how she feels there's something vengeful about the modern feminist movement, and she seemingly blames women for men's mental health issues.
I feel like there's something vengeful about the modern feminist movement, which is let's get them, let's diminish them, let's take over, let's push them out, let's beat them up, let's show them something really vengeful.
She says that the current education system prioritizes girls' way of learning because boys have more testosterone, and therefore they can't concentrate as long and need to run around.
Little boys need to run around. They have a lot of physical energy. They have tons of testosterone. When you're like between 3 and 6, you have a surge of testosterone, and all you want to do is run and jump and play and be outside. And what we're doing? We're putting them in school, making them sit in circle time. So we marginalize them, we label them, we say they have a problem, we say that they have ADHD, they have behavioral problems. And in many of them, the stress that I talked about is the stress of making little boys be more like little girls.
While it's certainly true that boys can't concentrate for as long and tend to be more hyperactive in school, part of the reason why girls outpace boys in academic settings is the fact that boys tend to develop at a slower rate than girls do. For example, in terms of language development, girls begin talking earlier, have larger vocabularies in early childhood, and exhibit more complex sentence structures from a young age. In terms of emotion regulation, girls have better impulse control, attentional focus, and emotion management, in part because the prefrontal cortex, which again is responsible for things like impulse control and decision-making, matures earlier in girls than it does in boys. In empathy, too, girls are more responsive to facial expressions from infancy, and they develop theory of mind, which is the ability to understand that people think and feel differently from you, earlier than boys do. So unfortunately, we can't blame it all on a feminist conspiracy. Girls do better in school partly because their brains develop more quickly. I guess that's what Erica would call an inconvenient truth, right? Also, socialization definitely plays a role here. Girls are typically taught to behave, sit quiet at school. They're more strongly punished when they're out of line, which partly contributes to why they end up doing better in school than boys. Erica also believes that the reason behind the large current divorce rate is that men and women compete over the same roles.
Now, what I think is causing a lot of these divorces and what's causing a lot of marital conflict is that men and women compete over everything.
Oh, so it's not the fact that women didn't have the financial means to remove themselves from marriages that weren't working for them before? I'd like to share an excerpt from a really brilliant book I read recently called Flow by a psychologist named Mihaly I'm so sorry, I don't think I can pronounce this name. He says, until a few decades ago, families tended to stay together because parents and children were forced to continue the relationship for extrinsic reasons. If divorces were rare in the past, it wasn't because husbands and wives loved each other more in the old times, but because husbands needed someone to cook and keep the house, wives needed someone to bring home the bacon, and children needed both parents in order to sleep, eat, and get a start in the world. The family values that the elders spent so much effort inculcating in the young were a reflection of this simple necessity, even when it was cloaked in religious and moral considerations. Of course, once family values were taught as being important, people learned to take them seriously, and they helped keep families from disintegrating. All too often, however, the moral rules were seen as an outside imposition, an external constraint under which husbands, wives, and children chafed. In such cases, the family may have remained intact physically, but it was internally riven with conflicts and hatred. The current disintegration of the family is the result of the slow disappearance of external reasons for staying married. The increase in the divorce rate is probably more affected by changes in the labor market that have increased women's employment opportunities and by the diffusion of labor-saving home appliances than it is by a lessening of love or of moral fiber. But extrinsic reasons are not the only ones for staying married and for living together in families. There are great opportunities for joy and growth that can only be experienced in family life, and these intrinsic rewards are no less present now than they were in the past. In fact, they're probably much more readily available today than they have been at any previous time. If the trend of traditional families keeping together mainly as a convenience is on the wane, the number of families that endure because their members enjoy each other may be increasing. So the bottom line here is yes, relationships now end in divorce that previously would have stayed together out of necessity, but we have a remarkable opportunity now to choose to stay in relationships that do bring us joy. And that is at its core my issue with Erica's interview. Her rhetoric, while thinly cloaked in research and facts, is nothing but an ideological attachment to the good old days when women had no choice but to stay home with the children. I know many wonderful stay-at-home moms, and I know people who were raised by stay-at-home moms who turned out to be wonderful. And I think it's great that the women's liberation movement now allows women to make a choice about whether they want to stay home with the children or go back to work. But I'm deeply concerned by people like Erica Komisar, who seem to want to convince women that they were forced into having this choice, that it's actually not in their children's best interests, that they should feel guilty if they choose to go back to work, and that the research is unequivocal in supporting their stance when it's not. This is the very first step. First, they get experts to convince us that there's only one right way to do things, and then they begin rolling out policies that make it harder and harder for women to be in the workforce. And before you know it, we're going to be back in the good old days when women were underrepresented in the workforce and trapped in unfulfilling marriages because they had no financial means to get out. And while I'll be in Europe rejecting this notion, continuing to do my best to be a mom and also have a successful career, I'm worried about Americans. I'm worried about the direction you guys are heading down. Be really careful with the messages that you're absorbing, because one day you're going to wake up and you won't have the choice to be financially free anymore. So it might sound romantic and it might sound like this self-sacrificial purpose in life to dedicate yourself fully just to your children, but don't let anyone manipulate you with cherry-picked research to convince you that that is the only right choice. Let me know what you thought about this, and I'll see you soon.